She was dragged to the wagon in silence. He was mending a fence when he first saw her. Neither knew what the other had lost, but the wind did. And before the sun fell twice, a bargain would change both their fates. The slap rang louder than the girl's cry. It echoed off the hills, scattering birds from brittle branches as if nature itself flinched. Ruth staggered, her hand cradling her cheek, but she didn't fall. Not yet. Not until the second sister shoved her from behind, sending her down the wooden steps of the homestead porch like a sack of flour tossed to the dirt. She landed hard, knees scraping open on the gravel path, her dress torn, her hair unraveling like rope left out in the rain. But still she didn't speak. "You shamed us," hissed Mercy, the eldest of the Wainwright sisters, her arms crossed like iron across her chest. "You brought a curse into this house." "I loved him," Ruth managed, voice hoarse and useless in the face of their scorn. "He said." "He lied," snapped Charity, the middle one, eyes colder than a well in winter. "And you were foolish enough to believe it. Now look at you. Belly swollen, face filthy. No man will have you now." From the side of the yard, their youngest brother Abel looked on, wide-eyed and wordless, his knuckles white around the handle of the pail he had been carrying. But he said nothing. He never did. Ruth didn't blame him. Boys weren't taught to speak in this family unless it was to bless a meal or recite from the good book under their father's old portrait. And that man was long dead, yet somehow still casting a shadow over everything they did. The wagon waited at the end of the path, harness creaking under the shifting weight of an impatient mule. At the reins sat Jedediah Crick, a sour-faced trader who dealt in livestock, timber, and sometimes people. Ruth had only seen him twice before, once when her sisters sold off a hired girl for talking back. The second, when her cousin disappeared after her second beating. "This ain't right," Ruth whispered, voice trembling as she pushed herself to her feet. "You're my sisters." "No," Mercy said, stepping close enough for Ruth to see the fine sweat beading her brow. "We were, but blood doesn't cover sin. You're not family anymore." Charity stepped forward, thrusting a sack into Ruth's arms. It was light, too light. A change of dress, a crust of bread, and a half-frozen flask of water. "You'll get $5 from him when he's tired of you," she said without emotion. "That's more than you deserve." They dragged her to the wagon like a prisoner, pushing her up into the bed without care. Ruth clutched her belly instinctively, wincing as her side struck the rough wood. Jedediah said nothing, just clicked his tongue and snapped the reins. The mule jerked forward, wheels crunching over frozen earth. She didn't cry. Not until the house was a smear in the distance. Not until the last sound she heard from home was the slamming of a door and the shrill barking of a dog. Jedediah didn't speak to her the first hour, or the second, just chewed on tobacco and spat it out the side like he was ridding himself of something foul. Finally, as the sun dipped low, he muttered, "Ain't my place to ask, but folks usually sell hogs, not kin." Ruth didn't reply. She just watched the trees blur by, her hand resting on her stomach where life stirred faintly beneath her ribs. The road stretched long ahead, endless and uncertain, but anything was better than staying, or so she tried to believe. They reached the trading post by dusk. It was no more than 3 buildings and a corral of shivering goats. Jedediah handed off a crate to a man waiting near the well, then circled back to the wagon. "Come on," he said to Ruth. "He's waiting." "Who?" she asked, voice dry as sand. Jedediah scratched his chin. "Fella from up north, said he needed help on the ranch, told him I'd find someone." "You told him?" Jedediah shrugged. "You ain't got options, girl." She wanted to run, but where? Her sisters had made sure of that. She had no coin, no horse, no coat thick enough to last a night out in the open, so she followed. What choice did she have? They rode out again just before nightfall, this time heading west. The hills turned jagged, the wind colder. Somewhere beyond the rise, a rancher hammered a rail back into a broken fence. He moved like someone used to pain, efficient, quiet, focused. His name was Ward Ellis, and though he didn't know it yet, the woman headed his way would do more than change his routine. She'd shatter it. He saw the wagon before he saw her. It kicked up dust along the ridge, drawing closer with the slow certainty of an approaching storm. Ward wiped his brow and set the hammer down, frowning as Jedediah pulled the mule to a stop by the barn. "Got your help," the trader called out, climbing down. "Bit sooner than expected, but she's strong enough." Ward stepped forward, wiping his hands on a rag. He wasn't a man of many words, and certainly not one to take in strangers easily. He looked up at the figure climbing down from the wagon bed and froze. She was filthy. Her dress was torn, face streaked with grime and something else, shame maybe. But she stood tall. She looked him in the eye, and there was no tremble in her voice when she said, "My name is Ruth." Ward blinked. "You got a last name?" "Don't think it matters anymore," she said flatly. Jedediah chuckled. "Told you she was bold." Ward didn't laugh. He just studied her, eyes flicking down to her rounded belly and back up. Then he sighed and nodded once. "Come inside." Ruth followed him across the yard, her boots catching on loose boards, her bones aching from the ride. The house wasn't much. A small porch, one lantern burning in the window, smoke rising faintly from the chimney. But it was warm inside, clean, smelled of ash and pine. Ward pointed to a chair near the stove. "You can sit. I ain't gonna ask what brought you here." Ruth lowered herself slowly, wincing as her muscles screamed in protest. "I ain't here to cause trouble," she said after a moment. "I don't doubt that," Ward replied. She glanced at him. He was tall, lean, with rough hands and a beard that looked like it hadn't known a comb in weeks. But there was something gentle in the way he moved. Something tired, too. "You live here alone?" "Since my brother died last winter," Ward said simply. "House ain't used to more than one pair of boots, but I reckon it'll manage." Silence fell between them, but not the heavy kind. It was just space, a breath between storms. Later that night, Ruth lay awake on a narrow cot in the corner room. The mattress was thin, but it was hers. She could hear Ward moving about in the other room, stoking the fire, locking the door, settling in. Safe sounds, honest sounds. She curled her arm around her belly and whispered to the child inside, "I don't know if this is the end or the start, but it's not the end of me." Outside the wind howled, but inside the fire held. And Ward Ellis, for all his silence, was already thinking about the girl who hadn't begged or cried, just stood there like a tree refusing to break. Morning came with frost clinging to the windows and a hush over the land so complete it seemed the world held its breath. Ruth woke early, blinking against the pale light seeping through the small curtain. For a few seconds she forgot where she was, forgot the wagon, the sisters, even the ache in her back. But then she moved, and the truth returned like a boot to the ribs. She sat up slowly, brushing strands of tangled hair from her face. Her hands went instinctively to her belly. The baby hadn't stirred much during the night, but she felt a faint flutter now, weak but there, still holding on, just like her. Outside the door she heard soft footsteps and the creak of floorboards. Ward was already up. She smelled coffee, faint but welcome. No shouting, no threats, just quiet movement and the sounds of a man going about his morning. It felt strange. Not safe exactly, she didn't know that word anymore, but not dangerous. And that alone was enough to make her pause. She opened the door gently and stepped into the main room. Ward stood at the stove, a tin mug in his hand, coat shrugged on over his shoulders. He glanced over when he heard her but didn't speak right away. "Hope you're not expecting breakfast," he muttered eventually. "I can manage coffee, but that's about it." Ruth offered a small smile. "I can cook." Ward didn't argue, just moved aside and gestured toward the kitchen. "There's beans and dried meat. Couple eggs if you're careful not to crack the shells." Ruth set to work, grateful for something to do. Her hands were clumsy at first, numb from cold and memory, but the rhythm came back quickly. She cooked in silence while Ward fed the animals, her mind drifting only slightly to the sisters who had cast her out, wondering if they were already pretending she never existed. By the time Ward came back in, brushing snow from his shoulders, the smell of food filled the cabin. He looked surprised, not by the meal but by the quiet efficiency of it. "You cook like someone who's fed a crowd before," he said, pulling up a chair. "I had to," Ruth replied, ladling beans onto a plate. "There were 6 of us, 7 if you count my uncle." "Big family," he said. She didn't answer, he didn't push. They ate in silence, the only sounds the clink of tin and the crackle of the fire. Ruth watched him from the corner of her eye, how he chewed slow, how his eyes never settled too long in one place. She guessed he was used to watching for trouble. She understood that. She was too. After breakfast, Ruth gathered the dishes without being asked. Ward stood, stretched, and rubbed the back of his neck. I need to patch the fence out by the east pasture. If the snow keeps melting like this, the post'll start leaning. I can help, Ruth said. Ward raised an eyebrow. You're expectin'. You shouldn't be lifting anything heavy. I can hold the tools, or just keep you company. He looked at her a moment longer, then nodded once. Suit yourself. The day was cold but dry, the sky a dull shade of gray that hinted at snow to come. They walked side by side to the pasture, saying little. Ruth carried a canvas sack filled with nails and a small hammer. Ward carried the weight of something heavier, grief maybe, or just years of silence that had thickened into habit. As they worked, Ruth noticed the land. How wide it was, how empty, but not dead. There were signs of life everywhere if you knew where to look. A rabbit trail near the fence line, claw marks on a post from some hungry animal, tracks near the stream. The ranch breathed even if it did so quietly. You ever get lonely? She asked suddenly, surprising even herself. Ward didn't stop hammering. Sometimes. Why'd you take me in? She asked after a beat. You didn't know me, still don't. He paused then, setting the hammer down and leaning against the post. His breath steamed in the air. Trader said you needed a place, he said, and I had space. That simple. I reckon so. Ruth nodded slowly, though she didn't quite believe him. No man opened his door to a pregnant stranger without a reason, but she didn't press. Not yet. They returned to the cabin before dusk, their hands red from cold, boots caked in half-melted snow. Ruth made stew with what she found in the pantry, potatoes, onion, some dried herbs, and by the time it was ready, Ward had stoked the fire until the room glowed warm and golden. That night she sat near the hearth with a quilt draped over her knees while Ward sharpened a blade by the table. Neither spoke much, but again, the silence wasn't cruel. It was simply space, time to breathe. Before she went to bed, Ruth stood by the door for a long while, staring out into the darkness. She could just barely make out the trail that led back toward her old home, though it felt wrong to call it that now. Home had never felt like a place where one mistake could exile you. She whispered a prayer under her breath, not for rescue, not for revenge, just strength, enough to make it through the next day. In the days that followed, a rhythm began to form. Ward would rise early and check the livestock, and Ruth would cook. She scrubbed the floors, mended the curtains, patched up his worn shirts without being asked. It wasn't penance, it was survival, a way to root herself in something again. She still hadn't asked about staying. Ward hadn't offered. They existed in a space between assumptions, neither naming what this arrangement was, maybe because naming it would make it fragile, or real. But the baby was coming. That reality grew heavier each day. She felt it in her back, her hips, the way her breath shortened when she bent too far. There would be no hiding soon, no pretending this was temporary. One night a storm rolled in, loud, wild, lashing the cabin with wind and sleet. Ruth woke to the sound of the shutters rattling and rose to stoke the fire. She found Ward already there, sitting in the dark, staring into the embers. You sleep at all? She asked quietly. Some. She poured water into a mug and sat beside him, the fire warming her knees. Storm like this could tear the roof off back home, she murmured. Ward glanced sideways at her. Where is home? She hesitated. Doesn't matter, I ain't welcome there anymore. He didn't press, just nodded. Folks can be cruel. They say they do it for righteousness, she said bitterly, but that's just another word for punishment. Ward looked at her, his jaw tight. Ain't no verse I know that says abandon the weak. Ruth blinked. She hadn't expected that, not from him, not from a man of so few words, but the truth in his voice settled something inside her. She turned to him. You ever been loved, Ward? The question hung in the air like a match above dry grass. Once, he said finally, a long time ago. What happened? She got sick, I couldn't stop it. Ruth nodded slowly. Loss didn't need many words, it just needed space to exist. The storm howled around them, but neither moved. The fire crackled on, steady despite the wind. And in that flickering silence something shifted. Not love, not yet, but maybe the beginning of it, a seed in winter soil. By morning the storm had passed. The world outside was white and quiet, as if blanketed in something clean. Ward made coffee. Ruth stirred at the stove. But just as the cabin settled into its familiar rhythm, a sound broke it. Hooves, approaching fast. Not a trader, not a neighbor, riders. Ward moved first, striding to the door, hand reaching for the rifle by the frame. Ruth froze, her heart hammering. She knew that sound. She'd heard it once before, just before her sisters threw her into the wagon bed. She stepped beside Ward, her voice low. "If it's them, don't let them take me." Ward looked down at her, face unreadable. "They won't." The door opened, and the past came riding in. The first man through the snow was already dismounting before the others even slowed. His coat was fine, a city tailor's work, not something meant for ranch dirt, and his hat sat at a proud tilt, untouched by wind or reason. He moved like someone who believed the world owed him space, and that everyone in it was just renting breath. Behind him, two other riders sat stiff in their saddles, watching the cabin with wary eyes and hands far too close to their belts. Ward didn't step outside. He stood in the open doorway, shoulders squared, the rifle resting against the inside frame where it couldn't be seen but could be reached fast if it came to that. Ruth stood a half step behind him, her hand clenched tight in the folds of her dress. Her heart thudded loud enough she was certain they could hear it. The man at the front tipped his hat, all false charm and slick smiles. "Morning," he called. "Depends," Ward replied, voice flat. The man chuckled. "I don't mean trouble. Name's Ezra Dole. I'm a man of business." "I'm not buying." Ezra raised his hands in mock surrender. "Didn't figure you were, but I think you might be housing something that belongs to others." Ward didn't blink. "Don't reckon I am." Ezra sighed, turned to glance at the rider on his right, then back again. "A girl, name of Ruth Wainwright. Heard she was spotted riding west in Jedediah Crick's wagon. He don't usually haul women unless there's profit involved." Ruth tensed behind Ward. Her throat tightened as if invisible fingers had found her neck. "She ain't yours," Ward said. Ezra's smile widened. "Didn't say she was, but she's of concern to folks back east. Families looking to tie up loose ends, you understand. Unfortunate business." "She ain't business." That made Ezra pause. His eyes narrowed just a fraction. The smile never left, but it went brittle, like a blade held too long to the whetstone. "Sir," he said, "I don't think you understand the arrangement. She's a problem to people who solve problems. Now I've been paid to bring her back. Doesn't need to get ugly. No courts, no lawmen, just a quiet ride home." Ward shifted slightly. The rifle was still in reach. Ruth didn't move, didn't breathe. "She's not going anywhere with you," Ward said, low and final. Ezra's jaw twitched, "even if she came out herself." "She's not." "You sure about that?" Ward stepped forward, just enough to block Ruth fully from view. "I said she's not." Ezra stared at him for a long moment. The tension in the air thickened, congealed. Even the horses felt it. One of the riders behind Ezra adjusted in his saddle, uneasy. Then Ezra laughed. Not loud, just a soft, cold sound like wind through a graveyard. "Well," he said, stepping backward, "you've made your position clear." He mounted without looking away from Ward. "We'll be around," he added, "in case she changes her mind, or you do." Then they turned just like that. Hooves crunching in the snow, backs disappearing down the trail. Ward didn't move until they were gone from sight. Then he turned to Ruth. "You knew them." She nodded. "Not him, but I know what they are." Ward said nothing for a moment. Then he shut the door, bolted it, and stepped back. "They come again," he said. "I won't talk so long." Ruth felt the shaking begin in her knees, rising through her like water rising in a sinking boat. She sank into the nearest chair before her legs gave out. The fire crackled like nothing had happened, but everything had. "What did they mean?" Ward asked quietly. "Folks tying up loose ends." Ruth stared at the floor. "My sisters, they didn't just want me gone, they wanted me erased." Ward waited, let the silence do the asking. "They're trying to marry into land," she continued, voice dull. "Old family, money, but I'm an embarrassment, a liability. They said if I came back they'd lose everything, so they found a way to make sure I couldn't." Ward didn't respond. He leaned on the table, brow furrowed, jaw clenched. When he finally spoke, it was quiet. "They won't get you, not from here." That night, neither of them slept much. Ruth lay on her cot, staring at the ceiling. Every creak of the walls felt like a warning. Every whistle of the wind a whisper of boots in snow. But morning came, and with it, a sky clean and cold. Ward didn't speak of the riders. He just handed Ruth her coat and pointed toward the barn. "Chores won't wait." So she followed him. They mucked stalls, broke ice in the water trough, scattered grain for the hens. Work had a way of pulling the fear out of her bones bit by bit, and Ward, though quiet, moved beside her like a stone wall, unshakable. By midday, Ruth was back in the cabin, stirring stew and watching the window. She didn't realize how much she'd changed in just a few weeks. Her hands had grown calloused, her arms stronger, her stomach heavier. But more than that, her eyes didn't flinch when shadows passed by. Not anymore. That night they ate in near silence, but not uncomfortable. The fire warmed the space between them. Ruth glanced up once, studied Ward's face. "Why did you let me stay?" He didn't look up, felt right. "That simple." Ward nodded. World's cruel enough, no reason to add to it. She smiled, just a flicker, but it was real. 3 short raps on the door. Ward was up in an instant, rifle in hand. Ruth stepped back, heart in her throat. But when the door opened, it was Ezra or his men. It was Jedediah Crick. He stood on the porch, hat in hand, face pale. "They're common," he said, "tonight." Ward didn't ask who. He just opened the door wider. "Get in." Jedediah stepped in, breathing heavy. "Ezra S. brought more men," he said. "Half-dozen at least. I heard M talking at the post. Said they're gonna come quiet, take the girl. No law, no trace." Ward's face went cold. "Why tell us?" Jedediah looked down. "Ain't proud of what I do, but selling her, that was wrong." He looked at Ruth, and for once there was shame in his eyes. "I don't want more blood on my hands." Ward nodded once, "Then help me board the windows." By nightfall the cabin was sealed tight. The fire doused, the lamps darkened. Ruth sat on the floor, clutching her belly, while Ward and Jedediah moved like ghosts, checking the perimeter, loading rounds. The hours stretched long, no one spoke. Then hooves. Not fast, just steady, approaching slow, deliberate. Ward was already by the window, eyes trained on the moonlit path. 6 riders, just as Jedediah said. They stopped 20 feet from the porch. Ezra's voice called out, smooth as ever. "Let's not make this messy." Ward said nothing. "You had your time," Ezra continued, "but she belongs elsewhere, and I've been paid to collect." Inside, Ruth's fingers tightened on the floorboards. Jedediah stood near the door, fists clenched. Ward finally stepped outside, rifle in hand, calm as ice. "You take another step," he said, "and I shoot." Ezra laughed. "We both know you're not the type." "You don't know me," Ward replied. Ezra motioned. 2 men dismounted. Ward aimed. The first man dropped before he hit the porch. Gunfire cracked through the night. Jedediah threw open the door, firing once, twice. The second man fell screaming. The others scattered, Ezra cursed. But Ward wasn't done. He stepped off the porch, rifle blazing. Ruth covered her ears, heart thundering. Then silence. When it was over, the snow was trampled, the ground stained. 4 men lay still. The rest had fled. Ward stood alone in the moonlight, rifle lowered, chest heaving. Jedediah joined him slowly, breath ragged. "You all right?" he asked. Ward didn't answer. He just stared down the trail, where Ezra's shadow had vanished into the trees. Inside, Ruth wept silently, not from fear, not from sorrow, but from something older. A root taking hold. The snow didn't melt that night. It held its silence, thick, watching, as if the land itself refused to exhale until it was sure the danger had passed. Ward stood in the yard long after the gunfire stopped, eyes pinned to the trail where Ezra had disappeared. The smell of gunpowder clung to his coat, but his fingers didn't shake. He'd done what needed doing. There was no pride in it, no triumph, only the solemn weight of having protected something fragile and knowing it would come with a cost. Jedediah bent beside the second man who had fallen. "Dead," he muttered, wiping blood on the snow. "Didn't even draw." Ward didn't respond. He knew there'd be consequences. Men like Ezra didn't forgive humiliation. They didn't forget when the money slipped from their grip and scattered in the wind. And Ruth, she wasn't just a girl anymore. She was the match that lit the fuse. They wouldn't stop at intimidation now. They'd come back armed, angry, and loud. Back inside the cabin, Ruth rocked slowly in the chair near the hearth, the fire long gone cold. Her hands rested on her belly. The baby hadn't moved much during the chaos, but now it kicked softly, like a whisper from the inside. She tried to focus on that, the tiny promise of life within her. Not the shots, not the dead men bleeding into the soil outside, not the feeling of helplessness that always came after survival. When Ward finally stepped back inside, his boots heavy on the floorboards, he didn't speak at first. He walked to the stove, poured a tin cup of water, drank, then poured another and handed it to her. "You all right?" he asked. She nodded, though her voice failed her. It wasn't fear that held her tongue, it was something deeper, something wordless, like standing at the edge of a cliff and realizing you hadn't fallen yet. Ward crouched beside her, his eyes steady. "He'll come back, not tonight, but soon." "I know," she said. He looked toward the cot in the far corner, then back at her. "You can't be here when he does." "I've nowhere else to go." "I didn't say leave." He stood slowly. "I said we can't wait here." Jedediah, leaning by the door, cleared his throat. "There's a cabin up in Hollow Ridge. Used to belong to a trapper. Ain't nobody used it since last spring. No road, no path, just trees." Ward nodded. "How far?" "Day's ride, less if we push." "I'll need a wagon," Ward said. "She can't ride horseback, not like this." Jedediah glanced at Ruth. "I'll see what I can find." Ruth looked between them. "You're running." "No," Ward said. "I'm repositioning." She almost smiled. They spent the next day gathering supplies. Blankets, dried meat, jerky, flour, coffee, salt. Ward packed carefully, methodically. Ruth folded the few clothes she had, none of them hers originally, and placed them into a canvas satchel. Every movement felt like a countdown. Jedediah returned by dusk with a small cart and a mule that looked one gust of wind from toppling over. "Ain't fast," he admitted, "but she'll get you there." Ward inspected the cart, adjusted the straps, and nodded. "It'll do." That night Ruth didn't sleep. She sat near the fire again, the rocking chair creaking beneath her. The baby was more restless than usual, and so was she. In the shadows, she saw her sisters' faces, not angry, not even cruel, just blank, like she'd never existed, like a story they had crossed out and moved on from. She turned her head. Ward sat at the table, sharpening his knife again, the sound rhythmic and slow, not because he expected to use it, but because it helped keep the silence at bay. "You've killed before," she said suddenly. He didn't look up. "Yes." "You weren't surprised last night. You didn't hesitate." "No." Ruth looked at the fire. "Does it ever stop weighing on you?" Ward set the knife down, looked at her. "No." She nodded. That felt honest. "Did you love her?" she asked. "The woman you lost?" "I did." "What was her name?" "Ada." Ruth repeated it under her breath, like a prayer. "She must have been strong." "She was quiet too, but when she smiled," he paused, "it was like watching the sun break through fog." Ruth watched the fire dance. "I hope someone says that about me someday." Ward stared at her a moment longer, then stood and stepped outside. The door creaked shut behind him. In the pale morning light, they loaded the cart. Jedediah stood off to the side, arms crossed. "You sure about this?" he asked. Ward didn't answer. "'Cause once she's gone and they don't find her, they'll turn to you." Ward tightened the strap on the mule's harness. "Let him." Jedediah sighed. "You're a hard man, Ellis." Ward looked at him. "No, just tired of cowards." They left before sunrise. The road to Hollow Ridge wasn't a road at all. It was a path worn by animals hidden beneath snow and thorn. The cart bucked and jolted. Ruth gripped the sides, wincing each time a wheel struck a rock, but she said nothing. This wasn't comfort, it was survival. Ward walked beside the mule, one hand steady on the reins. Every now and then he'd glance back at her. She'd nod, even when it hurt. By noon they reached the tree line. The air grew colder, heavier. Pines thickened on either side. The sun vanished behind cloud and branch. Ruth shivered. Feels like the world stopped turning up here. Ward didn't look back. That's why I chose it. The cabin wasn't much. A single-room structure tucked between two boulders, half hidden by a fallen tree. The door hung askew and a thick layer of snow coated the roof. But it stood. Ward pushed open the door. Dust and pine scent hit him. Mice had made nests in the corners, but otherwise the place was sound. He stepped aside to let Ruth in. She looked around. It's better than I imagined. He nodded. I'll fix the door, get a fire going, you sit. By dusk the place was warm. Smoke curled from the chimney. The wind howled outside, but inside it was quiet. Ruth stood by the window, staring into the trees. You think he'll find us? Ward stepped beside her. He might. She turned, and what then? I'll still be standing. She looked up at him, truly looked this time. And something passed between them, not romance, not desire. Something older, like two people who had been scraped raw by life and still kept walking. Later that night, after the stew, after the fire, after Ward's snores had settled into the rhythm of the wind, Ruth sat awake, hand resting on her belly. You're coming soon, she whispered. I don't know what kind of world I'm bringing you into, but I promise it won't be the one I came from. The wind rattled the cabin, but it didn't shake her. At first light, Ruth screamed. Ward jolted upright, rifle in hand, before his feet hit the floor. But it wasn't an attack, it was labor. She was bent double by the hearth, sweat beading on her forehead, breath coming in shallow gasps. It's happening, she choked. It's too soon. Ward dropped the rifle, rushed to her. What do I do? I don't know. He steadied her, helped her to the bed. I've seen calves born, but... Ruth gripped his arm. Don't compare me to cattle, Ward Ellis. He actually smiled at that, though fear hung thick in his eyes. Hours passed. The snow outside grew heavier. Inside, time slowed. Ruth cried out, cursed under her breath, then apologized. Ward boiled water, tore cloth, held her hand. She squeezed hard enough to break fingers. I can't, she sobbed once. You can, he said. You already are. By nightfall the child came. A girl. Small, red, wrinkled, angry at the cold. Ruth wept. Ward sat on the floor beside her, the newborn in his arms. He looked like he'd never held anything so small before. He cradled her like she might shatter. She's perfect, he said quietly. Ruth leaned back exhausted. She's free. Ward looked up. What will you name her? Ruth stared at the rafters. Grace. The wind howled louder now, but it couldn't get in. And for one fragile, fleeting moment, all was still. The days that followed Grace's birth blurred into one another, stitched together by sleepless nights and quiet work. The snow didn't let up, not fully, but the worst of the storm had passed. Inside the cabin, a different kind of weather took hold, one of hush and warmth, of slow healing and stolen glances between two people learning how to exist beside each other. Ward had never heard a baby cry before, not up close. He'd heard stories, seen neighbors' children squeal and wail from afar when he rode into town for supplies, but nothing had prepared him for the way Grace's cries could split the air at dawn and then fall into silence like nothing had ever been wrong, or the way her tiny fingers clutched at his coat, strong and trembling all at once. Ruth, pale and hollow-eyed from the birth, moved like someone who had been carrying weight long before pregnancy. Still, she got up each time Grace cried. She rocked her, fed her, whispered to her. Ward offered to help more than once, even tried, clumsily, to change a blanket, fetch more water, or rock the girl when Ruth's back gave out. But Ruth always took the child back like she was something carved from her own ribs. She likes you, Ruth said one morning, watching Grace fall asleep against Ward's chest. He sat stiff as a board, the baby a warm lump pressed against his shirt, arms half raised like he was scared to move. I don't know what I'm doing, he muttered. You're doing fine. She stopped crying when I picked her up. That normal. Ruth smiled faintly. Sometimes babies know what's safe. Ward didn't respond right away. He just looked down at Grace's tiny face, so still now, her lashes dark against her cheek, one small fist clenched near her mouth. You think we're safe? He asked, eyes still on the child. Ruth's smile faded. She glanced at the boarded windows, the untouched snow outside. I think we're hidden. That's not the same. They were quiet after that. Ward spent most days splitting wood, hauling water, checking the traps that dotted the hills surrounding Hollow Ridge. He never left sight of the cabin, and he always carried the rifle. Not once did he let his guard down. But time had a way of settling over them. The rhythm of survival became something like peace. Grace learned to cry less. Ruth regained strength, and Ward found himself returning sooner each time he stepped outside. He told himself it was for protection, for vigilance. But the truth, it pulled at him like a rope tied around his ribs. Ruth would catch him staring sometimes. Not at her, not in the way men stared at women, but at her hands. At the quiet way she folded laundry, smoothed out a quilt, hummed to her daughter, as if he was memorizing it all, expecting it to vanish any day. He wasn't wrong, because peace in the frontier never lasted long. It was Jedediah Crick who shattered the stillness. He came in on foot, staggering up the hill 2 weeks after the birth, his coat torn and his lip split. He pounded on the door just after sunrise, half collapsing into Ward's arms when it opened. "They're common," he gasped. "Ezra, he never left. He's been searching. Found someone who used to run traps up here, got wind of the cabin." Ward hauled him inside. Ruth stood in the corner, clutching Grace to her chest, face white as bone. "How many?" Ward asked. 4 men, Ezra's leading 'em, armed, angry. "Where?" "Half day out, maybe less. Took horses and a guide. They'll be here before nightfall." Ruth sank into a chair, holding her daughter tight. "I thought we had more time." Ward didn't answer. He pulled down the rifle, checked the chamber, then went to the crate in the corner and pulled out 2 more guns, both old, one rusted but usable. Jedediah sat shivering by the fire, pressing a rag to his face. "They'll kill us all." "No," Ward said, voice like gravel. "They'll try." The cabin became a war camp. Ward hammered planks across the windows tighter, poured oil near the perimeter for fire traps, cut sightlines through the brush. He laid out ammunition, lined up bottles across the mantel, filled jugs with water stacked wood-high near the hearth. Every movement was precise, practiced. Ruth watched him, Grace sleeping against her heart. "I can help," she said. "You already did." "Ward." He turned. "If anything happens, take the back door. There's a path behind the ridge, leads down to the creek, hide there." "I'm not leaving." "I'm not asking." They stared at each other, the weight of everything they hadn't said hanging between them like smoke. Then Ruth nodded once. Jedediah, to his credit, took the second rifle. "I ain't got much left to live for," he muttered, "but I ain't dying a coward." By dusk the air had thickened, heavy still, like something was holding its breath. Then came the hooves. Slow, purposeful, crunching the snow with cruel rhythm. Ward stood in the open doorway, rifle in hand, heart pounding, eyes cold. Ruth sat in the far corner, Grace nestled in a cradle made from an old crate and a blanket. Jedediah crouched by the window, watching. Ezra stepped into view just as the last light of day kissed the treetops. His coat was dusted with frost. His boots were clean. "Even in," he called out like it was a social call. Ward didn't respond. Ezra smiled. "You moved quick, I'll give you that, but you can't outrun what's owed." Ward said nothing. "I want the girl," Ezra continued. "The child, too. Family wants it all gone, clean slate. You can walk away. You've got no skin in this." "I do now," Ward said. Ezra's smile cracked. "You're gonna die for a woman you just met." Ward stepped outside. "I ain't gonna die." He raised the rifle. Gunfire exploded into the trees. Jedediah fired from the window, taking down one rider clean. The others scrambled, ducking for cover. Ezra dove behind a tree, cursing. Ward moved fast, calculated. He fired again, dropped another man, then ducked as bullets riddled the porch. Inside, Grace woke crying. Ruth didn't flinch. She grabbed a pistol Ward had left her and held it tight. If they got in, she would fight. She wouldn't let them take her daughter. Outside, Ward and Jedediah traded fire with the last 2 men. Ezra, pinned, shouted for them to flank the cabin. One tried, he never made it. Ward caught him in the side, the shot echoing like thunder. Then silence. Ezra's voice came, breathless, shaking. You can't win this, Ward. Mor'll come. Ward stepped forward into the clearing, smoke curling from the rifle barrel. You don't get to say her name again. Ezra stood. His gun was empty, his face pale. She's nothing, he spat. A mistake, a stain. Ward didn't blink. She's a mother. He pulled the trigger. Ezra dropped. The snow absorbed the noise, the blood, the weight of it all. Ward stood there for a long time, the rifle lowering slowly, breath fogging the air. When he finally turned, Jedediah was leaning against the cabin wall, bleeding from the shoulder, grinning like a fool. You're insane, he chuckled, but I'm glad I came. Inside, Ruth held Grace close, tears slipping down her cheeks. Relief, terror, something between them. Ward entered, covered in snow and ash. It's done, he said. Ruth looked up at him. Is it? He didn't answer. He just knelt beside the cradle, reached in, and gently touched Grace's tiny hand. She's safe, he whispered, for now. Outside, the snow began to fall again, quiet, unbothered, covering everything. The dead, the blood, the trail they wouldn't follow anymore. Ruth exhaled, deep, long. For the first time in weeks, maybe months, she didn't feel hunted. And when Ward took her hand in his, rough fingers curling around hers, she didn't pull away. They didn't speak of what came next. They didn't have to. They buried the bodies at first light. Not out of mercy. Those men hadn't come with mercy in their hearts, but out of necessity. Animals would find them if left exposed, and Ward wouldn't have their bones bleaching near the place where Ruth rocked her child and cooked over the fire. So he and Jedediah dug shallow graves beyond the ridge, far enough away that Grace wouldn't see them when she learned to walk. The ground was stubborn, the frost thick, but they worked in silence. Snow fell lightly, slow and lazy, as if the violence of the night before had never happened. When it was done, Ward stood over the last mound and crossed his arms. Jedediah spat to the side and muttered, "Never seen a man shoot like you. Thought you were just another rancher." Ward's gaze didn't shift. "I was once." Jedediah nodded, sensing the boundary in that answer. He didn't press. Back in the cabin, Ruth tended to the fire. She had slept little, her face pale and drawn, but her hands were steady. She moved like a woman who knew that rest was a luxury, not a guarantee. Grace lay swaddled beside her in the cradle Ward had built from old fence boards and worn blankets. Her breath came soft and even, innocent. When Ward returned, Ruth looked up. Their eyes met. No words passed between them, but something deeper did. The kind of understanding that doesn't need to be spoken. Ward set down his coat, his rifle, then crouched by the hearth, warming his hands. Ruth ladled broth into a tin cup and handed it to him. "You hurt?" she asked. He shook his head. "Not mine." She nodded, grateful. Jedediah sat in the corner, cradling his bandaged shoulder. "Well," he muttered, "guess I'm staying a while." "You should head back," Ward said. "They won't be sending more, not now." Jedediah snorted. "Not in this shape. Besides, ain't got much to head back to. You've got a woman and a baby. Could use another pair of hands." Ward didn't respond, but he didn't argue either. The days that followed felt strange. Quiet, but not in the way it had been before. The silence now was earned, deliberate, a lull after the storm. They didn't speak of Ezra again. His name became like smoke, once thick, now gone. Ruth didn't ask where they buried him. She didn't want to know. She just watched Grace grow, little by little, into the space that fear had once filled. The baby took to Ward faster than expected. She would cry in Ruth's arms, restless and stubborn but quiet the moment Ward held her. Ruth noticed. She never said anything, but the way her lips curled slightly each time told enough. And Ward, he changed, slowly, like a stone in a riverbed worn smooth without noticing. He talked more, not much and never about the past, but he'd mutter things when Grace cooed or when Ruth handed him a warm mug. Small things, enough. One evening, as snow whispered down outside and the fire painted the cabin walls gold, Ruth sat by the cradle, needle in hand, stitching a small quilt from scraps of old clothes. Grace had started to smile, just little twitches of her mouth, but Ruth swore they were smiles, and that night she caught one that made her laugh out loud. Ward, sitting at the table, looked up. "What is it?" She smiled, Ruth said, holding the baby up. Ward stood slowly and crossed the room. He looked down at the girl, who stared up at him with wide, curious eyes. She knows you, Ruth whispered, even this young. Ward reached out and Grace caught his finger in her tiny fist. He froze. Ruth watched him. She doesn't know what you've done, she said gently. She just knows who you are. Ward didn't look at her. His voice came low. She's lucky then. Ruth said nothing, just held the baby close and sat in the warmth of that moment. The snow thickened that night. By morning it was a wall outside the door. They were snowed in completely, but no one panicked. They had food, wood, water, and each other. Ward fixed a leak in the roof with old tarp and rope. Ruth boiled water, made stew from beans and salted pork. Jedediah slept long stretches, muttering in his dreams, but when he was awake, he helped where he could. The man was more useful than Ward expected, and more broken than he let on. One night Jedediah sat by the fire while Ruth bathed Grace in a small basin, humming low and sweet. Ward sat near the door, whittling wood into a spoon, trying to make it smooth enough for the baby. You know, Jedediah said, watching the flame, I wasn't always a trader. Ward didn't look up. No. Had a wife once, 2 boys. We ran cattle south of Galveston. What happened? Jedediah's eyes stayed on the fire. Fever took all 3 years after the war. Ruth paused her humming. I left, Jedediah went on. Couldn't sleep in that house. Couldn't walk that land without hearing their voices. Started traddin', wanderin'. Figured if I kept moving, grief wouldn't find me. Did it work? Ruth asked softly. He finally looked at her, for a while. She nodded. That's all we get, I think, a while. That night Ruth didn't sleep. Not because of Grace, who, for once, slept deeply, but because of the thoughts circling her mind like wolves around a campfire. She stepped outside, wrapped in a blanket, boots crunching softly on the porch. Ward was already there. She didn't jump. She just stood beside him, looking at the sky. Can't sleep either, she asked. He shook his head. Ruth watched her breath mist in the air. It's strange, she said. I used to believe God had a plan. Even when I was cast out, even when they sold me, I thought maybe he's testing me, or punishing me, but now I'm not so sure. Ward was quiet a long time. Then he said, maybe it's not punishment, maybe it's planting. She turned to him, brow furrowed. Sometimes, he said, the Lord doesn't strike, he buries deep. Lets you crack, split, rot in the dark so you can grow, stronger, wiser, harder to break. Ruth blinked. You believe that? I'm trying to. She smiled softly. Me too. They stood there side by side in the cold, not speaking, not needing to. Inside, Grace stirred but did not cry. Winter held its breath. And the past for once stayed quiet. Winter didn't let up, but it softened. The kind of soft that came after grief, after the tears had dried and the heart stopped aching, but not because it healed, only because it had learned to hold the pain without letting it drown you. The wind still howled some nights, but the walls of the little cabin on Hollow Ridge held firm, just like the 3 souls inside it, 4 if you counted the tiny one who made more noise than all of them combined. Ward woke before the sun now. He'd move quiet, slip on his boots, and check the traps before the light touched the trees. Ruth heard him go always, and always she stayed in bed, listening to his footsteps fade into the cold, until the silence returned and she could close her eyes without fear. Grace usually woke right after, fussing for milk, kicking her little feet in the hand-stitched quilt Ruth had finished just the week before. They had built something together, slow, uncertain, fragile, but real. Not a family like the ones Ruth had dreamed of as a girl. Not one with dancing and dinner tables full of kin. Not one with hymns sung in a parlor or hand-me-downs passed through generations. But something new. Something stitched from hurt and hard-won trust, from silence and kindness, and the choice to stay when leaving might have been easier. Jedediah was the first to say it. You know you're not just guests anymore, he muttered one evening, scratching his beard while Ward repaired the cradle legs. This ain't just a hideout now. This is yours. Ward didn't look up, never claimed it was. You didn't have to, Jedediah said. I've seen towns with less structure than this place. You've got rhythm now, roots. Ruth stirred stew in the pot and said nothing, but her cheeks flushed pink. Grace babbled softly nearby, clutching a rag doll Ward had whittled and Ruth had stitched together with leftover thread. She chewed its ear with ferocity, like it had wronged her in another life. Ward leaned back, flexed his hands. Roots can be dangerous, he muttered. They make it hard to run when trouble finds you. Jedediah chuckled. So can babies, and yet here we are. That night after Grace had gone to sleep and Jedediah's snores began to rattle the cabin walls, Ruth stepped out onto the porch again. She did it often now, wrapped in Ward's old coat, her hair braided back, the cold biting her cheeks just enough to remind her she was alive. Ward joined her minutes later without needing to be asked. "You always know," she said, not turning around. "You always wait for me." They stood there in silence, stars bright overhead. The moon hung like a cracked coin in the sky, pale and distant. "I've been thinking," Ruth said after a while, "about staying after the thaw." Ward didn't move. "You don't have to say that." "I'm not saying it because I have to." He turned his head just slightly. "You sure?" She nodded. "I don't want to go where I'm not wanted, and I've done enough running to know when I'm tired." He looked at her then. "This ain't an easy life." "I'm not an easy woman." Ward's lips twitched, almost a smile, almost. "I want to raise her here," Ruth continued, her voice soft but firm. "With trees and snow and quiet, not fear, not shame." "You can," Ward said. "You will." Ruth looked at him. "What about you?" He met her eyes. "I've been staying since the day you knocked on my door." That was the first time. Ruth took his hand without hesitation. Days passed, then weeks. The snow began to melt slowly, revealing patches of brown earth beneath. The sound of birds returned to the trees. Squirrels chased each other across branches, and Ruth began to open the windows during the warmer hours of the day, letting fresh air into the cabin. Jedediah announced he'd be leaving once the road cleared. "Been enough time," he said. "Figure I'll head west, maybe find a place of my own." "You sure?" Ward asked. Jedediah nodded. "Time to stop running, maybe time to find some roots of my own." He packed light, just a bedroll, some food, his old rifle. Ruth hugged him goodbye on the porch while Grace clapped her hands from the cradle. "You saved us," she whispered. Jedediah shook his head. "No, I just stuck around long enough to watch someone else do it." He mounted the mule Ward had repaired, nodded once, and rode down the trail. Ruth watched until he was gone. Then she went inside and cried quietly while Grace napped, not out of sadness, but from something deeper. Gratitude, maybe, or the ache of someone learning that people could leave without hurting you. Spring came with wildflowers and rain. The world around the cabin bloomed again, even though the past still hung in the air like morning mist. Ruth often walked with Grace strapped against her chest, whispering stories to her about things that hadn't happened yet, dreams of a garden out back, of goats and chickens and maybe, someday, a neighbor child to play with. She would point to trees and say, "That's where your daddy will build you a swing," though she never said it to Ward's face. He started calling her little one, the baby, not Ruth, though sometimes, late at night, Ruth wondered if he meant it for both of them. One warm evening, after they'd finished supper and Ward had brought in more firewood, Ruth found him sitting on the porch steps, watching the trees. The sun had set, but the last light still clung to the sky, turning it gold and purple. She sat beside him, careful not to wake Grace in her arms. "I've been thinking," she said. Ward didn't answer, just waited. "You ever think about what comes next?" He exhaled slowly. "Used to think I was done, after Ada, after the war, after losing my brother, thought I'd just keep to myself until the Lord called me in, but then you showed up." She turned to him. "Do you regret it?" "No," he said without hesitation, "not for a second." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "Then don't go quiet on me now." He looked down at her. "What are you asking, Ruth?" "I'm asking if you'd marry me." Ward blinked. "But sometimes," she said, "I wonder if I should write them, not to forgive, not to go back, just to tell them I'm not gone, that I'm not what they said I was." Ward leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "You'd be risking a thread. Sometimes threads pull." "I know." He looked at her steady. "I'd stand by you either way." She smiled, slow and sad. "That's why I haven't done it. I already got everything I need." Later that week, Ward took the mule down to the old trading post to restock supplies. Jedediah had sent word weeks earlier from a settlement further west, said he'd found a place working in a smith's shop, maybe thinking of marrying again. He enclosed a short note. "Tell the little one I still remember the fire in her eyes. Don't let her lose it." Ward came back with sugar flour, a small bolt of cotton cloth Ruth had requested, and a surprise tucked under his coat, a leather-bound journal, blank and new. "For what?" she asked when he handed it to her. "You write your thoughts," he said. "Your story. Maybe someday Grace will want to know it." Ruth opened it slowly, touched the first page. "I don't know where to start." Ward looked at her. "You already did." She wrote at night, after Grace slept and the fire dimmed. Small entries at first, memories, thoughts, pieces of scripture that gave her comfort. She wrote about the day she arrived, about the knock, about Ward's silence, and the way the floorboards had groaned under her weight as she stepped into his home like a ghost begging to be believed. She didn't romanticize it. She told it true. "I bled," she wrote one night. "Not just in body but in spirit. I thought I'd been emptied, but I was making space." She wrote about the first time Grace smiled, about the first stew that didn't burn, about the time Ward cried without meaning to when he held Grace and she said "Pa" for the first time, even though she meant "Ma," even though she had no idea what she'd said. Ruth didn't correct her, neither did Ward. The journal filled faster than she expected. Pages turned like seasons, and before she knew it the baby had begun to walk, stumbling across the cabin floor, arms out, laughter unbound. Her first real word, clear, deliberate, was wood. She said it pointing at a pile Ward had chopped that morning, and Ruth laughed so hard she dropped her ladle. "She knows what matters," Ward had said, scooping her up. "Gonna be strong." The child grew with the rhythm of the land, slow, then suddenly all at once. Ward built a small fence out back so she could wander safely, and Ruth taught her how to gather eggs without cracking them. They planted a garden, tomatoes, beans, a few stubborn onions. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. One late afternoon, Ruth stood beside Ward on the porch, hands on her hips, watching Grace try to feed a chicken with a stick. She leaned into him, head on his shoulder. "You ever think about going into town?" she asked. "Seeing people again?" He shook his head. "Not much use for people." "Maybe not, but I'd like to show her something bigger one day, a place where she can see other children." "We will," Ward said, "when the time's right." She looked up at him. "You'd come." "I ain't lettin' you go without me." The seasons turned again. Fall brought wind. The trees burned orange and gold, and the trail to the creek grew cluttered with leaves. Ruth took Grace there often. She taught her to throw stones, to listen for the echo when they splashed. She told her stories, not fairy tales but real stories, about women who survived and men who stood still when others ran. And one day, when Grace was nearly 2, Ruth sat her down by the hearth and began to read from the journal aloud. She didn't know what the child understood, maybe nothing, but the words felt good in her mouth, like a song returned to her after a long silence. That night she left the journal open on the table. Ward read it after she went asleep. He read all of it. The part about the knock, the betrayal, the fear, the hope, the things she never said out loud. He turned page after page until he found the one with his name. "I didn't expect him to stay," she had written, "but he did, and in staying he changed the shape of my sorrow." Ward closed the book, went outside, and wept beneath the stars. The next morning he built a swing from an old rope and a smooth board. He tied it between 2 trees in the clearing and carried Grace to it himself. Ruth watched from the porch, a hand over her mouth, heart full. "I think she likes it," she said. "She'll grow up strong," Ward replied. "She'll know joy." And Ruth stepped down into the yard, barefoot in the grass, hair loose around her shoulders, and took Ward's hand. "She already does," she whispered. They stood there, the 3 of them, in the middle of nowhere and everything. No church bells, no family gathering, no letters from the sisters who'd thrown her away. But there was wind in the trees, sun on their backs, and laughter in the air. She had been sold like she was nothing. But the rancher who took her in, he'd never once asked for her past. Only her hand. Only her trust. And in the end, what they built together wasn't a refuge. It was a life.